Welcome into a new BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel from Blue White Illustrated. It's the first BWI Live on a Wednesday in March as the Nittany Lions continue through winter workouts in football and the wrestling team gets ready for the Big Ten tournament. T. Frank, it's one of my favorite times of the year because we overlap sports. We have football on the cusp of spring practice. We have wrestling getting set for the postseason. And every now and again, there's some warm weather that mixes its way in during the March.
Love it.
During the month of March. So looking forward to a good show today. We got a lot to talk about, looking at the Penn State football offseason, some combine recap to get to as well. A quiet combine for Penn State. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But T. Frank, do you agree? Is it a good time of year? Do you enjoy this start of March as we come out of February? Winter is not over. Winter workouts are still ongoing. Spring practice is not yet here. Neither is spring. But we're inching closer to the start of spring practice, and it feels like the 2024 season just ended. So we talked about that, I think, a couple weeks ago, but certainly is worth bringing up again.
No, I don't like this time of year, honestly, because it's halfway between everything, so it means it's nothing. It's not warm enough to go outside and really be outside for very long. It's warm but raining. I don't mind. So, I don't mind the rain today. It just makes me want to take a nap. And then I just so I know I've been kind of talking about this and maybe obsessing a little bit about how long the season went and how different it was. But it's also this winter weightlifting session we're going to see tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about it in a second. Normally it's our first time really seeing these football players up close and in person since December, before Christmas. Right. And now I feel how much could have changed in a month? And that's really what it's been. So it's kind of it kind of takes a little bit of the fun out of this. Now you take more of the season than one day in February, usually at the end of February, of lifting and a lot of no context things for people that don't necessarily understand what's happening when you're doing max testing day. But still at the same time, this particular time of year, it's just, it reminds me of where I grew up. It's 3 hours from Buffalo. It's 3 hours from Pittsburgh. It's 3 hours from Cleveland. So it's the middle of nowhere when we're talking about things happening. Now, from the wrestling perspective, very not true. But from the football perspective, that's how I feel.
Be sure to check out the BWI YouTube channel later this week for our Big Ten wrestling preview. But let's talk football. Penn State will have us at the Lash building this week for, like you said, a winter workout session. And for Penn State, those are now, they started about a month ago, maybe a little bit less than that. But the on-field stuff, where you get those competitor of the day shout-outs on Twitter from the position coaches, they are 3 workouts into those. James Franklin told us last month that they were thinking they were going to do 6 this year instead of 8 to 10. We will see weightlifting and not that competition tomorrow. But yeah, it is an interesting point you make, T. Frank, that because of how long I think all of this ties together the first part of the show here, in that you had a lot of players. I saw something on social media yesterday that only 15 combine participants did everything, the on-field work and the off-field, 40-yard dash, bench press, things like that.
Nobody does the 3-cone anymore. Absolutely nobody does the 3-cone. And it's kind of frustrating because I think that's one of the most important and interesting drills. And forget the top players competing. They don't even do the on-field drills, which probably is the smartest thing for them. But damn, it does kind of take the fun out of the combine when the freaks aren't on display.
Right, and that was mostly, not completely, but mostly the case this year. Of course, Abdul Carter did not work out, injury-related. KJ Winston, as we're talking Penn State, not on the field as he recovers. To both of those guys eyeing Penn State Pro Day to be back in action, and we'll get to the one Nittany Lion who did most of the work in just a little bit. But T. Frank, what are you looking to see this week? And we're going to hear from Chuck Losey as well. So maybe more pertinently, what are you interested in finding out about his perspective on things? I think obviously it goes without saying that maybe the first question, if not the second one he's going to get, is about how they had to adjust things with how long the 2024 season went. Beyond that, what strikes your interest in terms of things the multi-year now Penn State strength coach could talk about?
I'm just always obsessively interested in recovery. And the guys that are injured, where are they in that process? And how are they kind of the timeline is the timeline. And so we're going to get into this in just a little bit, but that's always what I'm interested in this time of year is not necessarily who's making the most strides and who's he going to talk about positively when you ask him, but what are the challenges they're overcoming at this point? And we've talked a lot about that stuff, and it's something that he won't get into. They don't discuss injuries. They don't discuss progression, but progression from those surgeries and things like that. But it is something that I think is super important, and we underrate quite a bit in this time of year. It's not getting back to where you were last year for some of these guys is the goal, not progression, not getting better, just maintaining. And so, like, that's a challenge. If you want your team to get better, there has to be progression somewhere. So to me, that's it. And then, like I said, I do like playing the looks like game when you get there of like, that dude put on weight. That dude looks bigger. That dude looks like he's, gotten stronger. And we haven't seen them lift, but we've seen them recently. So it'll be interesting to see. I remember this time last year, Cam Wallace really stood out as a guy who put on weight and was like much improved from the year before. So I don't know if there's a guy that's going to be like that, but we'll find out. And then, seeing some guys up close and in person for the first time, like maybe like a Liam Andrews, if he's there, because they don't do everybody all at once. They do in cycles for the most part. So maybe like half the team or 2/3 of the team is lifting on Thursday, and then another group is lifting later. So you don't get to see everybody, but maybe our first look at somebody up close and personal.
Yeah, I think to me the focus will be any January enrollees and or transfers that are there. Obviously, guys we would get to see for the first time in this setting, and then also any of the quote-unquote non-travel guys. Of course, once Penn State got into the college football playoff, they were able to take as many players with them, not like the Big Ten season where they're capped. So some of those guys were, technically traveling with the team, but not on the travel squad, so to speak. So that group has been obviously going about things a little bit differently than the guys who were on the field or in backup roles for the college football playoff. So to your point of a Cam Wallace, is there somebody from that either second-year player group or maybe even third-year player group that has made considerable strides? I think that'll be a big focus, both from the looks perspective and then also from Chuck Losey. And I'm also curious to hear his perspective on how they're going to move into from winter workouts to spring ball. Because as you note, you have to make the progression somewhere. And if you are trying to, they have tiers, right, of what guys are doing in these winter workouts. Spring practice will be the same way. So how does, from his, perspective as a strength coach, what does he want to accomplish during that time based on what they accomplished already this year, both during the extra time they had together with the 2024 team and then since this 2025 team got together about a month ago, give or take. So plenty to talk about there. We'll have complete coverage over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and, of course, here. But that is the next stop on the roadmap. Anything, I don't know if you've been paying close attention to them, but of the competitor of the day guys, which there's obviously debate about what that means, what those mean, if anything. Any of those the picks so far of the 3 days stand out to you? I'll give you a second to think about it. But to me, two things have stood out. Number one, Peter Gonzalez was back in action. I'm not sure if you guys covered that on yesterday's show.
It was the one we got to. You picked the one I was going to say because I did not see yesterday's. But yeah, that'd be the one of participation is super important. Like, this is what I've been talking about. Like, participation and development is super important for a guy like Peter Gonzalez. Being able to participate looks optimistic for the spring. Whether or not that is, whether he's cleared for contact or not is a different story, but it's a great sign that he's running and competing with his teammates for sure. Yeah.
And Zariah Fisher was a pick earlier this, I guess late last month at this point as well. February goes by so fast, it almost doesn't feel like a month, but yeah, Zariah Fisher kind of in a similar boat there of a guy back in action, at least in this part of the offseason, whether or not, or where he'll be for spring practice in terms of being medically cleared to do this, that, or the other thing remains to be seen. And then one other guy who was a pick yesterday in the same conversation, Jackson Smolik, the Penn State quarterback who we saw do some light work in pregame that he was cleared to do throughout the 2024 season. He was picked as a competitor of the day yesterday as well. So that's been probably the biggest takeaway to me of the 3 days so far, other than Elliott Washington, veteran Penn State cornerback entering his junior season, a 3-time pick in 3 sessions from Penn State cornerback coach Terry Smith. So that's caught my eye as well.
He's a guy that's interesting because talking to him for a little bit and kind of just getting a sense of his on-field demeanor, and you can kind of get a sense of personality sometimes through play style. He is an intense dude, talking to him and then watching him play football. So I'm not surprised that a guy who is as athletic and as competitive and as intense as he is kind of getting those accolades. It'll be interesting to see how that translates into the defense and into playing time based on a lot of different factors, which we're going to get to at the end of the show. I'm super excited to talk about Jim Knowles' defense, some of the things I've learned this week, but he's an important piece of the puzzle for Penn State in a cornerback room that is not short on talent, but experience is certainly lacking from the guys that are returning this year, outside of probably A.J. Harris, who's got 1 year under his belt.
Yeah, interesting group there on the Penn State defense, one we'll follow closely throughout the offseason. Let's move into some chatter wrapping up the NFL Combine. Penn State had five former players on hand, and all of them participated in all aspects of the Combine. As we noted at the top of the show, Abdul Carter, Tyler Warren, KJ Winston all sat out drills in Indianapolis. Kobe King did the on-field work, did not do any of the testing as far as I know. May have done the bench press. I don't think that was the case either, though. Yeah, and Jalen Reed then was the only Nittany Lion who did just about everything in Indianapolis. So let's start with him. Penn State safety, very good player. He feels he was underrated in college. He still feels like he's underrated in NFL draft prep. Certainly, you can understand his perspective from the amount of football he played at Penn State and what he accomplished versus some of the accolades that have not come his way or ones that he may have thought should have come his way. I know you wrote about this over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. What was your just main takeaway or takeaways on his time at the Combine and how it could change his outlook? Pro selection process set for late April in Green Bay. He, of course, will not be. I think there's 8 guys or 9 guys, maybe 10 a total that will be in the green room, potential first-round picks. He's obviously not one of them, but certainly a guy who is interesting in terms of I think there's going to be plenty of debate about where he could end up going.
I don't have any question.
Yeah.
I don't have any question. I think, he's a mid-round draft pick, a day 2 selection. I did wonder about his speed. And that was the one thing that I think he had to really prove at the Combine. And it was not just good, but much better. He was really good for him. Again, there's this conversation of, I think people look at raw 40 times and expect every player to run a 4.41 or a 4.39. And that's the standard for a defensive back. Safety is vastly different between corner and safety. And safety is vastly different between free safety and strong safety and between schemes. And this is what I wrote about this week, is that Penn State is hitting the sweet spot of draftable NFL safeties with really strong athletic testing metrics that fit the modern defenses that are too high defenses, meaning too deep safeties, whether it's quarters, half, cover 2, cover 6, mixed coverage defenses that are designed to take away the deep ball, but also have to be involved in the run game. So instead of having a prototype of a free safety and a prototype of a strong safety, you need 2 guys generally. And these are general, very broad terms. Right. You need 2 guys that can do a little bit of everything in these schemes that are trying to obscure the coverage and take away the deep ball. But because you're not running sideline to sideline as the individual free safety, and there's a little bit more protection, you don't need to run a 4.3. You need to be a good athlete. And here is the comparison from Jaquan Brisker to Jalen Reed of the Penn State safeties in the historical data, which you can get at the NFL Combine website. Jalen Reed running 22 miles an hour. Tig Brown running 22 miles an hour. Super consistent on that tracking data. It's not necessarily the 40-yard dash time. It's how fast were they going at their max speed. And then just some of these metrics here, and it's not a long enough graph to look at all of it, but roughly identical in a lot of these different places. The vertical, really similar. Jaquan Brisker, about an inch taller, maybe half an inch taller. You would expect him to be a little bit bigger. Jalen Reed coming in heavier than some of these guys. Their wingspan, about the same. Their arm length, about the same. Their hand size, about the same. All of these important metrics to Penn State, to NFL teams. And I know that some people are going to roll their eyes at the idea that these metrics matter. The film matters, but then you're looking for what are the things that are going to prohibit you from being as good on film in the NFL that it is in college. And it is a threshold. You have to meet certain thresholds because at a certain point, you're an outlier. Right. If you're 5'8" and you're playing safety, there are guys that do it, but not many. And just Jalen Reed, because he's literally stacked side by side to second and third round draft picks, he's going to be a second or third round draft pick. And he's got, again, the film to match those guys. Different qualities, different style of play. They're not all the exact same, but they all are in that sweet spot of these are two high safeties that are going to fit in the NFL because they can do both. They can play the run, they can play the pass, and they can be versatile and smart in a defense that asks a lot of them.
Yeah, so I'm very curious to see what more Jalen Reed does at Penn State Pro Day. He strikes me as a guy that even if he was happy with most of his combine numbers, that will not stop him from trying to better them at Penn State Pro Day, which will make Penn State was one of the many reasons, I should say, that Penn State Pro Day will, I think, be one of the more watched ones nationally in terms of the fact that Abdul Carter seems very confident that he will be able to do stuff at Penn State Pro Day. KJ Winston, I'm sure, feels the same way. Kobe King wants to boost his draft stock. Tyler
I'm wondering.
Horn go ahead.
I'm just wondering who's going to actually do some of these things at the Pro Day. KJ Winston, I think, doesn't need to in terms of like if he doesn't do well, he's not going to get drafted. That's ridiculous. But a bad 40 time, does that hurt Tyler Warren in an area where it doesn't need to run a 40? You know, he's considered a top 20 at worst draft pick. Does he need to run a 40? And Kobe King, does he need to run a 40 if it's going to be a number that he doesn't like? Which, again, he showed up at 236 pounds, listed at 250 on the Penn State roster for most of his career, 236, and he still didn't run at the combine.
Right.
You know, I don't know what end of season weight loss of performance and going so long in the season does to your general like plan for the combine. But are you gonna run if you don't want to? I think it does say something of like, hey, I'm not running. That generally says it's probably not a good time. And if you don't run at your combine or your pro day, that kind of tells me like, okay, even in best case scenario, I don't want to post this 40 times. That's an illuminating thing. So I'm not saying that they won't. I'm just saying there is a case for some of these guys that maybe you don't run a 40 and we don't get that data ever, you know, from especially a guy like Tyler Warren.
Right. These Penn State players and their agents, of course, have about a little less than a month to get those plans formalized before Penn State Pro Day on March 28. Will be fascinating. Obviously, some guys who did not get invited to the NFL Combine, headlined by Jalen Kimber, will work out at Penn State Pro Day. I'm sure. I would assume he's going to work out there anyway. So very interesting. I guess let's end this conversation before we move on to what I would call the headliner topic of today's show with this. 5 Penn State NFL Combine participants. How many, and I think we both agree they will all get drafted of the group that went to the Combine. How many more Penn State players do you think will get drafted? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, the two that jump to my mind immediately are Kimber and Keziah Izzard, because I think they have NFL measurables. And, you know, I thought Keziah Izzard, watching some of the defensive tackles, I totally understand why he wasn't invited. And because you can't invite everyone worthy of being drafted when you have so many good defensive tackles. That was one of the best athlete performances from that position I've seen watching the Combine, and I rarely miss a Combine. So I get why he wasn't invited, but then I'm watching like the Florida defensive tackle, who the reason he's there is he's 6'5", 320, and they want to bring in a nose tackle so that teams that have a nose tackle, they can get an eye on him. But Izzard is a better athlete. He's, you know, I don't know about that guy's play in terms of his on-film production. I've only watched a little bit of Florida when scouting some of Penn State's transfers. I didn't know about that guy. I just think like there are players on Penn State that were deserving of going to the Combine, but didn't get invited because of the depth of their position. And Izzard is the guy that jumps to the top of my mind. I don't remember the full list of guys that didn't get invited, though. Is there anybody else I'm missing?
No, those two obviously stand out, and we know that Amin Vanover will now be preparing for the NFL draft. So he's a guy.
He's a great one. That's a great one.
It's fascinating, and you know, when you talk about Pro Day, you know, this is a guy who was waiting to see if he would get another year. He did not, but I'm almost certain, I don't have the calendar in front of me, but almost certain that the Combine invite list was out prior to him making that decision. And that's not to say he would have been invited if he declared earlier, but the point is that they didn't even have a chance as far as I recollect the calendar. So what does he do at Penn State Pro Day to put himself on the radar of NFL teams? We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I think this is not going to, certainly it's fair to say this will not be a record setting in terms of the total number of drafted players from Penn State. but there is a part of me that's starting to wonder if there might not be a few more than maybe initially anticipated when you saw how many guys were coming back. I think a fair total previously may have been 6.5. And maybe that's still fair. You get the 5 combine guys, and then you're either saying 2 more will get drafted or won't get drafted. Maybe 7.5 is a better number. We have a lot of time in off season to talk about all that, so we won't go too far down that rabbit hole. But certainly an interesting NFL path to the draft upcoming for those Penn State players. And we'll see. And Pro Day is, like we said, not that far away. And that means spring practice is not that far away either. So exciting times. You're listening to the Wednesday, March 5th edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. I see some people in the comments. Thank you all for joining us. If you have anything you'd like us to cover, as always, throw it in the comments. We will get to it when we can in today's show. And we're going to move on now.
Can I jump in quickly for one thing?
Certainly can. Yes.
As you mentioned, we've got a lot of time to talk. It's the deep off season. So I know we always ask you as a courtesy to like the video, subscribe, all those great things. This time of year, it's super important because there's a lot of people that are checking out because it's the beginning of March and spring football is still 20 days away. If you just please don't forget, like the video, helps us with the almighty algorithm, and helps a sleepy morning in State College or in Harrisburg, just for the YouTube algorithm to not fall asleep on us. And, I'm not worried about how we're going to be doing. We're doing great. I just don't like at all any slippage. So the numbers are important to me, and I appreciate you guys with your help.
Yes, please like, subscribe. Thank you for doing that. Check us out over at bluewhiteillustrated.com as well for the latest Penn State news. There's some recruiting intel that just went up this morning and some other good information as well from T. Frank, from Ryan Snyder, Nate Bauer, Sean Fitz. And we will keep you posted throughout the offseason. Various Penn State sports covered. It's all just $1 for the first week of access. So join us there for, again, recruiting, transfer portal. Obviously, that's not too far away at this point, the spring window. Winter workouts, wrestling, basketball, you name it, you got it over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. As we mentioned, it is deep in the offseason, which means today we're going to dive into our top 5 best case scenarios. T. Frank and I are going to go back and forth in a battle of rankings of the top 5 offseason outcomes for Penn State in a best case scenario. And look, let me just say this. When T. Frank texted me this morning as we were getting the rundown together, and I looked at his list and I was putting mine together, the first thing that became evident to me almost immediately is that 5 is not enough spots. But we do not have 5 hours to sit here and talk about all 500 potential candidates for this list. So what we're going to do is go 5 through 1. See, I always want to mess that up and go 1 through 5, and then that ruins the whole breakdown.
That's how you were taught to count.
Right.
You were taught to count starting at 1. That's not surprise. That's very normal.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Middletown math problem that we tend to have down in these parts, but that may not be the way we were set to count. Anyway, let's get into number 5.
Number 5.
All right, T. Frank, I'm going to have you lead off here. Top 5 best case scenarios for Penn State offseason. Number 5 for you is?
Yeah, just the young players that we expect to get better actually get better. And I think that there's this expectation that doesn't always align with reality. And Cooper Cousins is there on the graphic if you're watching on the YouTube channel. He's good, right? And he is a guy that's going to put in the time to be good. But if you're expecting him to just take over the right guard position with 0 hiccups, and we see this all the time. Abdul Carter took kind of a step back because we saw some more of his flaws in his game because he wasn't asked to do simple things his sophomore season. He has to do more, take more of the load. Cooper Cousins came in very specific situations to do very specific things last year. And so pass protection, where is he in understanding of blitz pickup? Where is he in understanding of his fundamentals and footwork so that is something he doesn't have to think about? These are the little nuanced things he's got to be working on this offseason. And just generally, they're, especially on the defensive side of the ball, young guys, Xavier Gilliam, Max Granville, Dejon Lane, way more like second or third year guys that you need something out of this year in the 2 deep. And that growth curve, which is really encouraging for guys like Granville or Cousins or Lane. Luke Reynolds, I think, is a kind of a given in this situation as well. You just need to have that continue. And it doesn't always do that. Like, growth is not linear. It's not a thing that happens as an exponential chart. There's ups, there's downs, there's peaks, there's valleys. And so as smoothing out of that as possible is what you're looking for this offseason, for that to be a transition from Sal Wormley to Cooper Cousins, if that's what you're thinking, or for Dejon Lane to take a starting role, or for Max Granville to kind of have that Chop Robinson role when Nick Tarburton was the starter, but Chop Robinson was the guy that was really making plays in 21 or 22, whatever that was, on the Penn State defense. So that's where I'm starting of just the expected growth happens. And the expected growth, maybe some guys are ahead of schedule, like an Egan Boyer, let's say, a guy who, if Anthony Donko isn't healthy, you need a third tackle. Is he a third tackle? Right. Javen Williams can be in that conversation as well. So whomever you need to step up, steps up, and has that natural progression.
Yeah, and I think this is where you get into the conversation we had a little bit earlier on today's show, where you know that Penn State's season went long, and what did the extra development time on the practice field mean for these guys? And are they further ahead because there was a whole nother month basically of developmental squad practices and work on the D squad against the first team, second team, so on and so forth? And what did that do for these guys? Not just the ones we all know about who burned their red shirt or came close to doing so, but the ones who were, you know, maybe further along physically and could have played at a school where they weren't blocked by somebody or somebody's at their position, but certainly on the practice field, impressed. And so I'm curious to see, overall, it's a good place to start as in terms of just where that group can go. And the fact that obviously it goes without saying, but for Penn State, it needs it to go on the trajectory that Penn State and its fans would hope it is going to. Yeah,
even a guy like, you can throw Kobe Howard into this conversation, you know, in terms of a guy who's here for an early enrollee that physically isn't too far off and is a good receiver. Like, I don't really know, because Kobe Howard had such a sporadic high school career. It's hard to find like consistent film on him, but he's a guy that if he puts in the work, there's obvious an opportunity. So yeah. What about you? Where are you starting with 5?
Yeah, so actually, let's just roll ahead in, because your number 5, or my number 5 rather, and your number 4 are the same, so we can combo tag team this one a while and then get to your number 4.
Number 4.
All right, so my number 5, T. Frank's number 4, focuses on the integration and implementation of Jim Knowles' defense with the Nittany Lions during spring practice and ahead of preseason camp. Obviously, we heard last month that they were going to spend a lot of time getting Jim Knowles' system in place with what Penn State has done and what Jim Knowles wants to do and has done, of course. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more in the film study, so we don't have to belabor the point here. But, it goes without saying that T. Frank, last year at this time, we were having a similar conversation. We were talking about what Penn State had to do to integrate a couple new coordinators ahead of spring practice, and now it finds itself in a spot where it is doing so with Jim Knowles. And obviously they hired Jim Knowles knowing what he does and wants to do. And Penn State and Jim Knowles came to Penn State knowing what it does and it wants to do. So I don't expect this to be a huge lift, but it goes without, it's obvious that there's a lot of just from a simple terminology perspective, and you call your your base defense this package X, and I call it Y. Well, what are we going to call it now? And so it starts at that level, and then obviously branches out to how you're going to teach it, how you're going to coach it, so on and so forth. And so to me, in the best case world, Penn State comes out of spring practice saying it is further ahead with putting its defense in under Jim Knowles than it thought it was going to be. And whether or not that'll be the case, obviously we won't know for about 2 months at least. But I certainly think there's a big key, to the Penn State offseason is getting that defense, not just replacing the production loss, but also filling in the necessary cracks isn't the right word, but necessary parts of Jim Knowles' defense and the puzzle pieces he wants into the Penn State puzzle that already exist.
So it's interesting. There's a lot of overlap in the spirit of what they would do. Now, how they went about doing it is different. And, alignment and player X is doing Y, right? But in terms of zone dropping defensive ends or moving Abdul Carter around the formation or playing safeties in certain alignments, there's a reason Penn State has had some consistent success in churning defensive coordinators, not intentionally, but like going from Brent Pry to Manny Diaz and to, all the way now to Jim Knowles through Tom Allen. I'd say Manny Diaz had the longest curve because they tried to do some very different things and kind of that was the year it took them to get into this style of defense. And they didn't really get all the way there because they had 3 good linebackers, but now they're there. And so I think that there's the way you put it is get as much out of Jim Knowles' system as possible. Right. So to me, that means maximizing the talent on the roster. And to me, how much of his mind is going to be manifest on the field. Right. And they're saying the same thing, but they're kind of in a different category of the players pick up on what he wants to do quickly and are able to implement as full of a vision as possible without getting into 100% of the playbook. And some of the things that he does, Penn State runs a lot of different coverages. He runs a lot of different coverages and also some tweaks that are more NFL style in there from a communication issue situation and from a stylistically how that coverage looks.
Right.
I don't know they're getting all the way down to those details, but getting the umbrella in terms of 3 safeties, 2 corners, or a nickel, however you want to define it, those back 5 communicating in synchronization, to me, that's the most important thing for this defense to present that that style, because there's a lot that goes on in that defense. Yes. At least that's how it was at Ohio State the last 2 years. Maybe they shift and simplify some things and make some of that complexity appear in the front 7. That might be easier. Either way, what they decide to do gets to your point of maximizing the talent and making guys that aren't Abdul Carter be very productive.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that interests me about this too, and this was not something I don't believe, maybe I'm misremembering, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we asked Jim Knowles when he spoke at his intro presser back in I guess it was early February. Yeah. What he learned about coming to a new school and what the best practices are, and maybe what he's learned that not the best practices are for getting his defense in the best place possible in year 1. And I'd be curious to find out at some point this offseason what he's learned on that front in terms of where, maybe you can go a little bit further than he thought that wasn't previously possible, and maybe where he's found that it's not worth going as far based on just how things played out during the season. So curious about that. Certainly, he's been around football a long time, and so has the Penn State coaching staff. So they will put the best practices in place. But I would be curious at some point to find out what he's learned about that over the course of his career. My number 4, and we'll get to your number 3 because they kind of go hand in hand. But my number 4 was no setbacks in recovery for the currently banged up Nittany Lions. So we all know that some players either missed time down the stretch or fought through injuries, things of that nature during Penn State's college football playoff run. So goes, it's fairly, Penn State, certainly has some guys who are probably certainly almost definitely in need of some recovery time, be it because they needed off-season surgery or because whatever ailed them just needs time to rest. So the key, of course, is that there's no setbacks in whatever recovery is going on for these guys during this offseason that, again, started a little bit later than normal. As we've said, some of these guys were already on the path to having done what needed to be done. Anthony Donko, who was on the graphic there, if you're watching on YouTube, comes to mind as a guy who got whatever work he needed done and is on the path to recovery. So, but there's plenty of guys in that spectrum. Even guys that we mentioned Peter Gonzalez earlier, who were hurt at a prior point of the season that want to get back. Andrew Rappley is another one that comes to mind. Alonzo Ford. Yep. So on and so forth. And, they're guys that, that's more of the quote unquote long-term guys. And then we'll get into some others with your number 3 coming up next.
Number 3.
All right. Number 3 on T. Frank's top 5 best case scenarios for the Penn State football offseason is speedy recovery for guys who, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's this is supposed to be realistic, like the top 5 most realistic things in the bounds of possibility that that can happen for Penn State this offseason. That like we can see.
So like Micah Parsons getting more eligibility is not, or Saquon Barkley getting more eligibility, not on this list.
Right, or Penn State getting a transfer, or like for the people out there, for the people I'm arguing in the comment section, which is like the number one rule not to do here on YouTube, but like James Franklin's not going to leave as the head coach. If you think that's the number one problem with Penn State football is a bad sideline coach, that's not happening. Like that, these are the realistic things that can help the team get to a new place and to either maintain their performance from last season or improve upon it. So to me, you're saying no setbacks, which I think is more realistic than what I'm saying here is be ahead of schedule. That would be ideal. The number one way to settle the defensive tackle issue for Penn State? Alonzo Ford's healthy. Then you've got 2 really strong, different style body types at that defensive tackle position. But here's the thing. November 23rd is really late in the season to have an injury, especially a season-ending injury. And while I don't have the confirmation of what the injury is or the timeline for recovery, let's just say I'm going to pull a number out of the air. 9 months is return to play from a particular injury. Now, that might be August, right? Especially for big athletes that are athletic and explosive, there is a massive difference between cleared to play and playing at the level you were at last year. PJ Mustipher, just go back and watch the way he played pre-injury, post-injury. It's a major thing. And again, for every athlete, but if you are big and explosive, that's just more mountain you've got to move. And so if you could be healthier by September than you would be of like 12 months, let's say a year from the injury, the end of the season when much of this is decided, that'd be massive. And I think him in particular at that position where you don't have a Nolan Rucci as that, wow, we found something there. You don't have that just yet at defensive tackle. Maybe you get that this offseason, and now you've got depth for days. That'd be great. But right now, the most optimal thing was just get back what you already had. And then I put Tony Rojas here because I will, again, point out he played injured last season. Just because he didn't have surgery doesn't mean he wasn't injured. He did. So we don't expect him to see him in spring football. So Tony Rojas getting better and being ahead of schedule is twofold. First off, the problems he had, the major issues he had last year in performance were related to that injury. That is the first hypothetical best case scenario, that he shows up as aggressive and as confident and as physical as he was previous, and it wasn't an issue with his tackling or his technique as much. He's a young player, so it's probably a little bit of both. And then he's able to recover from that quickly and, get a little bit of progression this offseason. So I would put all of that in together of getting ahead of schedule. And obviously Donko would be huge for them as a guy who is their best offensive lineman. Getting him back that's always nice, right?
Yes, there's no doubt about that. Penn State will be hoping for that. Obviously, it's a fine line, right? You don't want to rush guys back and then cause further aggravation, but you certainly want it back on the field as soon as possible. So yes, in an ideal world, you would be able to marry those and get to the place you want to be by the time preseason camp starts, or at very least early in the season. My number 3, because 40 minutes almost without a mention of the receiver position on a BWI live show is just too long.
Heresy.
Is receiver sorting and getting a hierarchy in place for the Penn State receiver room. So we're going to talk about your number 1 pick, which is in this ballpark of conversation. Yeah. But, to me, I guess what I'm getting at here is I don't think if you're a Penn State fan, you want to hear James Franklin talking in August about trying to find the Trey Wallace thing where we need him to be one of the best receivers in the Big Ten in the country.
We've got 2 or 3 guys, right, and then there's a group that need to step up, right?
Yeah, I half wonder, and it's actually more than half wonder, if we're not going to see James Franklin take the tact with receiver conversation that he talked about with the offensive line a couple years ago, where he pretty much refused to talk about him until they proved. He said, "I'll let those guys prove it on the field." And I'm half wondering if he goes that way with the receiver conversation this offseason. But yeah, to me, it goes. It's you need to figure out what the order is, and you have 3 preseason games that are essentially walkovers. So I'm not preseason games, September games. They might as well be preseason games. They're about the same equivalent wise, but you have some time in September to figure things out. You don't need to be 100% locked into anything necessarily to beat those 3 non-conference opponents. But it certainly, I think, would certainly for fans make them feel better if Penn State had a pretty good feel for what its hierarchy, its depth chart was going to look like coming out of the preseason. Not necessarily spring practice, because there's only 15 of those. There's only so much you're going to do. But certainly as you get through portions of preseason camp, get that sorted out, get things in place, and not have it be so much of a guessing game as maybe it's been in the past.
Yeah, and chemistry, all those things with the quarterback, you'd establish those in the offseason. That's a big thing. When you've got an entirely new receiver room with a quarterback who's in the final year of his NFL draft prospect contract, where he's got to make that move, sorting all of that out, as you pointed out, is really important.
Yes. So Penn State, of course, brings in some transfers. Could look for some more in spring transfer portal window. We'll have to wait and see about that. Obviously, return some guys as well. And so we will continue to talk about the receiver position at Penn State this offseason, including a little bit later in this show. But T. Frank, let's get to number 2 on our list of the top 5 best case scenarios for Penn State this offseason.
Number 2.
So slightly different conversation than the one we had with my pick at number 4 a short while ago. So that was no setbacks for players that we already came off of the 2024 season with some kind of an issue. This one focuses on not having any more of them, and not
so practical.
Right. And quite frankly, this probably should be number 1, but we both had this at number 2. But yeah, certainly, last spring, I was looking back through some analytics over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and some of our top stories from the spring last year. And unfortunately, a couple of them dealt with injuries that were either of the short or long-term variety. And of course, the less of those you hear about and read during spring and certainly preseason camp, the better. And so for Penn State, in a best-case world, I think it's probably, I don't know, somewhere between naive and unrealistic to think you can get through an entire offseason without any issues. Maybe it can. You just got to be lucky, obviously, because you just never know. But certainly as few of them as possible, key to any college football team's offseason, and certainly Penn State's.
Yeah, your list in terms of practicality of getting as much as possible out of Jim Knowles' system, no setbacks and no new injuries. Like, maintain the status quo. I always think of Pirates of the Caribbean. Stop blowing holes in my ship. Like, don't create any more problems in your depth chart before the season actually starts. That will happen. There will be injuries. Like we saw, Khalil Dinkins got banged up last training camp. Luke Reynolds, Liam Clifford, Caden Saunders. Even before the starters that got long-term injuries that were out for the season, Andrew Appiah, all of that you will have guys get banged up, but having them be as minimal as possible, where a guy like Dinkins comes back and is a major contributor for you all year long, and it is not a massive setback. I think that, maintain what you have is a big part of football, which is a game of attrition. Like it is, even when it comes to your abilities throughout a football season, players don't get stronger. They just maintain better than other players. That's, I think, something that I always forget. Like Nick Singleton and Katron Allen didn't get better as the season went on. They got healthier, and they were able to maybe reclaim some of what they had lost due to injury throughout the season. They didn't, in my opinion, I don't think this is possible, physically get better throughout the season. There's a big difference, and this is a Chuck Losey thing maybe for tomorrow that I understand a little bit, but like there's a difference between performance time and building towards performance time. You talk about athletes peaking. So you need to be in performance shape from September through now February, basically January. Yes. You're not going, unless you're on the D squad, unless you're Max Granville, whose primary focus is get bigger and stronger. To my understanding, it's virtually impossible to perform and build muscle and get stronger and faster all at the same time. So like you need to do that and maintain all of that now. and not lose any of that time now.
Yes. And so I think that's a good number 2 for both of us on this list, only because number 1's a little bit more fun to talk about. Let's get to number 1 on our list. Top 5 best case scenarios for Penn State this offseason.
Number 1.
T-Frank, I'm going to, again, have you bat lead off here, and then I will come in the 2-hole and go with my number 1 pick. But yours is pretty simple and pretty much what everyone's been waiting for. A top dog emerges at wide receiver for Penn State football. Your number 1 on this list of best case scenarios. What does that look like in your mind? And I think the answer could be obvious, but maybe not. So
no, we're going all the way to the top. A borderline star emerges. I don't care who it is. So this is the best case scenario for Penn State. It's also the best case scenario for our mental health, that we finally have a new conversation around the wide receiver position. And this goes to a lot of different ways. Now, honorable mention in the article I wrote, this is all based off kind of the article I wrote last night at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Honorable mention is something in that article, deals with Drew Aller. You're not actually going to see it until it starts. The season starts. We're talking about the offseason here. And the genuine understanding, if Penn State has a wide receiver 1, a stud at the position, you're not really going to know that until football starts. But we'll know the way they talk about the player. We'll know what we see in camp. We'll know if they get a guy in the portal. And honestly, I don't care how it happens, but I think it would be holistically good for Penn State if they went out into the portal and dropped a bomb on everybody and got a star wide receiver. That is PR. That's changing the narrative about Penn State. That's putting you in the news cycle. And all of that is fine. It's ancillary things, but then back it up with production. Not only does that make the season go better, not only does that make Drew Aller look better, it restarts the engine on the position, saying you can be a receiver at Penn State and be a star. Because that absolutely is not the case right now. I don't think anyone really believes that based on the last 3-4 years, going back to Jahan Dotson, right? So fix it. Fix that this offseason. Get that position back on track. Because here's the thing, and this is going to be a little derogatory, and I apologize. I'm not trying to rain on your parade. Receiver is a vastly more impactful position in terms of explosive plays and game outcomes and tipping the game in your favor than running back or tight end. You can be tight end you, and that is great. It's better to be receiver you. The evidence is clear. Now, receiver position, harder to find those dudes in a vast sea because everyone produces 3 receivers a year. Finding the special ones is as hard as other positions. And I don't think that Penn State should de-emphasize tight end or running back. But if you can find a stud receiver, so many problems are solved schematically and perceptionally, if perceptionally is a word.
Yes. All right. Well, it's a good segue to my number 1, which is somewhat along the same lines, not quite the same, but for me, the top thing here is replacing Tyler Warren's production. That doesn't necessarily have to be a tight end. It could be a tight end because this is a twofold conversation in my mind, in the sense that, number one of the things I keep hearing, not necessarily in the chat today, but just in general, is people worried about how Penn State will replace the massive amount of production Tyler Warren had in Penn State's offense. And so, to the point you made a couple seconds ago, you're not going to get that answer until we actually see these guys on the field. And I hate to keep going back to the same well here, but with the way the non-conference schedule currently looks, I don't know if you're going to know this until Penn State host Oregon in late September. Yeah, but you have to figure out with Tyler Warren moving on, but you have all these pieces back on offense. How do you replace his snaps and his production at tight end? And then how do you replace his overall impact on this Penn State offense? And that's what Andy Kotelnicki and his staff have been hard at work at doing since the 2024 season ended. It's one of those fun questions to talk about, and it will take up a lot of time here and elsewhere this offseason because there's a lot of different directions for that to go. Yeah. The key, of course, will be figuring out.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Are you speaking of in the offense overall or in the tight end room, in replacing? Both. Okay. Yeah,
Yep.
and that's fair. But I think that there is this idea that Penn State is going to throw to the tight ends
Sure.
the same amount. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. And I also think that the emphasis on the total yardage, the raw stats it's kind of missing the point, because generally my assumption is Penn State's going to be in generally the same spot in terms of total yards that they were able to accumulate as they were last year if they play the same number of games. They played 16 games, so the numbers are bananas for last year. If they don't play in the Big Ten championship game but still make the playoff, that's going to change the number of yardage and output of touchdowns and things like that.
Right.
But I think that from the talent perspective, they're going to be able to do that. I think holistically, how do they replace him? What is the core of this offense? I think that's a really good point of how do they replace that in the style in which they're trying to get those yards.
Right. And so I think it does go a little bit to both of those buckets in terms of what you do at tight end. Who steps up there? Is it Khalil Dinkins? Is it Luke Reynolds? Is it a healthy Andrew Rappley coming back? Does Andrew Elish have an impact as a freshman? Does Joey Schlaffer make a move in that room? There's options without question, but how does Penn State, just from a general snap count perspective, and to your point, that is one thing Penn State fans and us as well, I think are going to have to be careful of as we get closer to the season is, you're right, Penn State played a lot of games last season. And so you have to keep that in perspective when doing any kind of statistical comparison or projection, for that matter, up to the 2025 season, because 2024 certainly, I love the some of the notes that came out during the playoff run about, the longest season and this and that and the other thing, but it was never reflected in the stats portion of the notes. Nope. And certainly those two things are without question tied together and go hand in hand.
Yep. Happily going to say Tyler Warren has the most receptions for a tight end or whatever that was. And he did it, by the way. I'm not taking it away, but the context is important there. I do think so. Just one thing that I've been thinking about. I did a piece on Nolan Rucci and his development, and I was going back and watching film from the beginning of the season, and it was comical how much Andrew Rappley was plowing dudes over in the run game. So just a note, don't forget about Andrew Rappley. Right. I don't know how it's going to work out, but that dude, before Luke Reynolds emerged and before Tyler Warren had his season, everyone was very excited about the battle between Dinkins and Rappley and how they were going to fit into the offense. I don't think that that's necessarily over. Injury can kind of derail a guy's career, and other guys can jump you because of that. But he's not the kind of guy that's just going to get jumped. He's going to be in the conversation.
That's what I would expect as well. And we'll see, again, that Ty Howe has continued to produce a lot of talented tight ends and draftable tight ends and tight ends that make big jumps while they're on campus in short amounts of time. So very interested to see how that pecking order plays out at Penn State in 2025. Any other thoughts on this topic, T. Frank, before we head down the home stretch with the Sunday film study?
Yeah, Christian puts this in the chat, says throw more to the wide receivers on early downs. Getting them involved in the game early, consistently. Yeah, that's something I think is a fair thing I found this year. And that's part of what I'm talking about with Tyler Warren and replacing his production. It doesn't always have to funnel through the tight end. We've seen Andy Kotelnicki funnel the offense through whomever is the most optimal player. At 1 year at Buffalo was a tight end. The next year it was a receiver who went and played in the NFL. He's had outside receivers, slot receivers, running backs. He will design the offense to get the ball to the best player. It's better if it's a receiver, just generally, because you can get the ball to the running back and you can get the ball to the tight end in schematic situation. You can scheme it up for those guys. You need your receivers to win and to be open and to be kind of a reliable part of the offense. And Rob asked this question: how much more does the number one receiver need than 750 yards, 5 touchdowns? That's about what Wallace had. Again, in a 16-game season. I hate to put the same. So a 16-game college season compared to a 16-game NFL season, I think you need to be closer to 1,000 yards if you're the number one receiver. College and NFL are different, and so that's not fair 100%. But if we're just going for, I'm having a knee-jerk reaction to what Rob asked here. I would say 8 touchdowns, 9 touchdowns, somewhere around there. For a really productive number one receiver, 1,000 yards should not be hard if it was that if we're comparing apples to apples from last season.
Interesting. So that will be a big topic of conversation as we get into more preseason and then, of course, the season. But yeah, I think that's we'll save that for another show during a slow time. Maybe some stat numbers to keep in mind based on what you need to do to win at the highest level, and obviously play as many games as Penn State did versus what may have been perhaps a little bit inflated and not obviously a number you'll take, but not one you need. At this position or that position. We'll save that for another show down the road. Let's get into the Sunday film study as we come down the home stretch of this edition of BWI Live over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, you have been looking deep into the Jim Knowles evolution of his defense, what it could mean to Penn State in 2025. Give me the high-level takeaway at this point of what you've learned so far. I know you've been checking out various parts of his past and what he's done and so on and so forth. So take it away.
Yeah, first off, please go read the articles at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. I'm pretty proud of what I was able to uncover because let me put it this way. I did your homework for you so that you don't have to go back and try and find highlights on YouTube or any of those things. Like in terms of watching at Oklahoma, like I went back to 2019 and watched film at Oklahoma State to see where this thing started and where it ended up at Ohio State. And it was fascinating. It was genuinely fascinating. I was able to watch a coaching clinic on how he describes how he uses the Leo. I was even able to find a description from a physical and a traits perspective that he puts into what he's looking for that position. Again, that's in the article. So you want the full breakdown. We don't have time to get into it today. Please go check it out. It's a 2-part series over on the website. And the main thing that I want to get to when talking about this is my interpretation of how his scheme evolved over time. Oklahoma State, he was replicating what he did at Duke and earlier in terms of having that Jack, Leo, Tom Allen called it the bull position, where it's a hybrid defensive end that plays some in coverage, plays off the ball a little bit, but is a full-time defensive end roving around the field, a hybrid player. And then injuries happen at one point in the timeline, so it simplifies some of the things they do in that defense. And then he transitions that to Ohio State. If you've been following the story, the drama of what happened at Ohio State between Jim Knowles and some of the defensive staff, he even said, we dabbled with it, I think, or he experimented with it at Ohio State his first season. Jack Sawyer played the position. The maximum it was like 14 snaps against Toledo. Then they stopped doing it. But the point of this position, this Leo Jack position, is to create issues for the offense, especially in run situations, but generally with the offensive line for blocking, pass protection, and things like that. They stopped using a defensive end. They just played those guys on the end of the line of scrimmage, and then that kind of went away. The idea and the spirit of it evolved from 22 to 23, where there was this experimentation phase from what I saw, and I picked up on this trying to watch it in 23, trying to learn his defense in 2023.
Yeah.
They started experimenting with 3 safeties and playing a safety closer to the box. One of those safeties against Penn State was Sonny Styles, who eventually played linebacker for them in 24. And the idea didn't go away. It just shifted and eventually became Caleb Downs. And talked about this last season, both on the Tailgate Show here on the BWI Live Show, that he was kind of a pseudo linebacker for them at a certain point, which is exactly what they were doing with the defensive end at Oklahoma State. So we've been talking about this. I think it reframed the conversation in my mind of there were these hybrid players in Jim Knowles' system. There's one hybrid idea that evolved from one position to the other through force, essentially. Circumstance of, well, I'm locked out of using this guy. How do I get that into my defense? And then we see the evolution, the iteration going into Caleb Downs being that special player that is doing those hybrid style roles, but from a different place and from a different concept of how I apply that to the defense. That's my best read of it. And I think that shows a lot. First off, does Penn State have the ability to play both hybrid positions like we've been talking about? Are they going to do that? Do they need to do that? Do you need to have 2 hybrid positions? This is what's on the table in spring football in my mind. Who's the best player to build the defense around from this guy's talented and can do the things that I want? Is it the Jack position, the Leo position, whatever you want to call it, on from the defensive end? Who's going to play some snaps off the ball and is going to move around the formation? If Abdul Carter was on the roster, zero question, that's what they'd do. If KJ Winston was on the roster, zero question, they would have that ability within the defense to play him this way. So Penn State's had this hybrid lion position. I don't know that that's what this is going to be. I think it's going to be something different based on what we saw at Ohio State. That's my best pitch. And if you want to read the details, and I even have some videos from 23, some of the ways that Penn State used Abdul Carter that are similar, and all that stuff in the article on the website. I was fascinated by all of this, and I hope that kind of makes you interested in as well. It's not just the Sunday film study. It started like last Friday and was like 4 or 5 days of deep dives on film. And like, I didn't go back and watch every single snap of defense from 2019 to now, because I do have a life, but I do feel like this is a good roadmap of where he's evolved and what you can expect, or at least gives you a map of what to expect from Jim Knowles this upcoming season. And then when we see things develop, we know kind of the way they're going with the defense.
You can find T. Frank's On 3 Plus 2-part series on this at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Also, the latest recruiting news, Penn State football and Penn State athletic news at bluewhiteillustrated.com. It's $1 for the first week, and you can sign up at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the video if you're watching here on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, please leave us any feedback there as well. T. Frank, this Wednesday show is about in the books. Final thoughts?
Yeah, so we have a super consistent podcast audience. Like, it's fascinating the things that you see in the metrics, and don't want to reveal all the accounting here on the show. But if you're listening on the podcast and you're still listening at this point, interact with it, because we've had a really strong podcast audience, but I want everyone to know about this show. And that's one way where Apple Podcasts, I don't know how all of that nonsense works, but please subscribe if and interact with it. Leave a comment, leave a conversation on that side of things and help us grow that side. I can't do all this on my own, unfortunately. I would do it for you. I don't want to give you homework, but if you could do that, I would really appreciate that. We would really appreciate that, so we can keep growing and bringing, I hope, the best conversation and content to the Penn State football community. And we do need a little bit of your help. I'm playing around with ideas of maybe starting a competition with some of our other YouTube sites. I've mentioned this in the past of Penn State fans, you're the best, right? You're the most loyal fan base. What if I told you that both the Ohio State and the Notre Dame sites have double the amount of people that are subscribed? Food for thought as my camera dies.
That is Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. We appreciate you being with us on this edition of the BWI Live Show, Wednesday, March 5th. Be sure to join us tomorrow. The recruiting show is back. Obviously, lots of official visits going on, things of that nature. We'll have a Penn State wrestling show here on the BWI channels later this week. And until next time, it's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. It's been BWI Live. Thanks for joining us.